Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Andre, for the introduction. I'm going to try to introduce you a little bit to the who, where, and what of the agreement before these two spar off for a rematch. As you may have heard, the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement is a collaborative effort among all of these companies that you see listed up here and all the conservation organizations, 20 on the forestry side and 9 conservation organizations. Covers an area of land of about 72 million hectares, multiple states in comparison, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Maryland, I think, if you add it all together. I put it into Canadian terms, you can see it stretching from British Columbia to Newfoundland. And within that, 29 million hectares have been deferred from industrial activity by forestry for 3 years while we try and come up with solutions that are consistent with our agreement. So it gives you a sense of the scale from coast to coast, northern and southern boreal forests. We like to describe the agreement itself as a globally significant business and conservation agreement. And we don't use the term lightly, and I think it's appropriate in the context of the International Year of the Forest to think about the agreement at this global scale. Nothing of this size, or sometimes we think complexity, has ever been tried on a global scale, and we think that when we're successful at delivering the outcomes of this, that it will be a gift to the world on a truly global scale. We hope that it's going to attract investment, create employment, and deliver a competitive advantage to the Canadian industry as a result of achieving truly global conservation outcomes. And I did tell you about this already. Just zooming in a little bit on the area of the agreement itself, you can see the spatial extent of the areas where we've, by agreement, decided not to have industrial activity expand while we negotiate the next steps of implementation. And you can see that the scale of that is quite large across the country. Just a bit of background on the agreement itself and the timelines and attributes of it as we worked through the almost 2-year process leading up to the signing of the agreement in 2010. We started in 2008. In very short order, we managed to come up with an intent to move forward and broad understanding of what we'd like to try and accomplish. But from that, for almost a year and a half, we spent outlining the agreement itself. And then in the last few months, some very fast and furious activity to try and finalize what the agreement itself would be, with a launch on May 18th, 2010. The deferrals that I've shown you on the map were the part of the immediate commitments on the conservation side from the companies. From the environmental organization's perspective is that they agreed to immediately end some of the do not buy campaigns focused on some of the major companies and their products. So there's a win on the conservation side, and from the forest industry side, they could see a way to come to the table and work with the conservation groups because they'd be protected from marketplace action for the period of the agreement. The format of the agreement itself has 6 goals. It has independent auditing of the implementation of those 6 goals over the course of the agreement, a 3-year implementation period, which we're now about a year and a half into, that involves both communities and First Nations, provincial governments as well, of course, in an important decision-making role, and frequent reporting to the marketplace and to the public on the progress that we're making. And just a few months ago, we did our first major report on progress to date. From the perspective of the Ivy Foundation, this was something that when it became clear that there was an opportunity to actually see this agreement signed, that we as an organization felt that we had to dedicate a lot of our resources to this. To us, it's the culmination of a 10-year, $25 million investment in Canadian forest conservation, Most of the elements of the agreement are areas that we'd been funding in throughout that period. And to us, it really built on 2 decades of progressive work by the NGO community, by governments moving to conserve Canadian forests, and industry trying to make changes in their own practice. So for us, it was a bit of a no-brainer that we would really want to see this move forward and be successful. We engaged probably more directly in this negotiation and are engaging more directly in its implementation than any other program that we've supported as the foundation, going back throughout its entire history, back to the 1940s. Acting both directly as a convener and a funder of the components of the negotiation and the agreement itself, but also actively participating in that and actually signing the agreement ourselves. Being a foundation, we don't necessarily seek public profile nor need it. We're not fundraising. We have our own internal sources of revenue. We felt this was so important to us and to the country that we put our name on it as well, and are holding ourselves accountable for the outcomes and not just the people that we fund. Just a brief overview of the elements of the agreement. Many of you will have read it all in detail, I'm sure, but just in case you haven't, I will give you the whirlwind overview. The perhaps most important one from in terms of the scale of the landscape change that we hope that it can impact is changes in the way that forest practices occur. So on every square inch of the tenures of the forest companies whose signatories, there's a commitment to raise the bar on forest practices. So change the way that forestry actually occurs in the ground, the number of trees that are left, how silviculture is done, and to raise that up and build from the standards that were built under the Forest Stewardship Council and the Boreal Forest Standard. We also know that across the Boreal, woodland caribou are a signature species that is threatened. It's been listed under the Federal Species at Risk Act and in several provincial species at risk legislation. We know that something needs to be done about that. We agree on that, and there's a commitment there to develop strategies that are going to be effective to ensure that that species moves back from the brink and recovers and can prosper in lands that are managed by the member companies. We also want to see the completion of protected areas system that's fully representative of the ecological diversity that exists in the Boreal within the tenures. We know that the world is going to be increasingly dominated by discussions around climate policy, climate change. The forests themselves are going to be changed by changing climate conditions. And we have a number of initiatives under the banner of climate change that are designed to be proactive in positioning both the Canadian industry and Canadian forests in a way that can be resilient to the impacts of climate change and the policies related to them going forward. We also realize that one of the key elements that are going to determine the success of this agreement are how communities survive, how they respond economically and socially to the implementation of this agreement. And we have a commitment to work on issues related to that economic survival together. And lastly, but not least importantly, we have a joint commitment to communicate with the marketplace to support the achievements of the companies as they implement this agreement, as caribou areas are protected areas are established, as forest practices change, to secure benefits for the companies that are participants in the marketplace at a national, international scale. And I am not going to go over all the individual goals again, because I just have done an overview of that. In terms of key beneficiaries from our perspective, we see that communities are likely to have more and stable jobs created by investment in a revitalized forest industry going forward. When the companies are successful, they hire more people, communities benefit across the country. At a First Nations level, many of the issues that are included in the agreement have been issues of long-standing concern to First Nation communities. Protection of cultural values, ecological values, species like caribou, creation of protected areas for cultural reasons, new employment opportunities in companies that are successful. Provincial governments, many of the issues that the forest industry and the environmental community have argued over for years are areas of provincial government decision-making responsibility. And we feel that by helping solve some of these problems in the dialogue that's underway under the agreement, that we can help make life a lot easier for provincial governments and also help them on the economic and community development side by creating more economic opportunity. And just lastly, what the agreement is not. It's not a done deal, and I think when we release the agreement, part of the blame can be put on our shoulders of communicating the agreement as big and covering this huge area and producing maps. And we wanted to do that because we wanted people to really understand the potential for it. But the deal is not done. This is an agreement between all of the parties to work on these areas, to come up with solutions, to recommend them to communities and government, and not to usurp the authority of either provincial governments or First Nations to actually approve the decisions that need to be made on the ground. And so it's not a replacement for the authority or the decision-making power for those people, but instead it's our commitment to bring solutions to the table that are going to actually help people have better information about making decisions and have two long-term antagonists agreeing on solutions going forward. And so with that, I will wrap up and let our two boxers take over.